to the channel. If you are new to this channel, this is a channel about sound design and synthesizers. And the exercise I want to propose to you today is based on the Prodigy song Breathe and the suggestion of an interesting workflow making use of the trendy technology of AI as a starting point, and from there trying to design my own patch on an analog hardware synthesizer. When I did my research for this video, it was very interesting. I found controversies on the internet. If I look at Wikipedia, the official version is that Jim Daves, Prodigy's guitar player, has recorded this lead sound in his guitar. But I've also found on the sampling community very interesting sampling mapping to the James Bond theme song alongside with the drum beat sampling and also the iconic sword sound from this song. Anyways, if you are a big fan of Prodigy, let me know in the comments what do you think is the real source for that iconic lead sound. But my point here is to walk you through this process. For this exercise, I've used the virtual instrument Synth Plant AI. I'm not endorsed by any products here, and I'm not encouraging you to buy any products, but I wanted to show this interesting workflow there. So in this video, I will spend some time explaining how I took the lessons from the AI output there and try to apply to create this very patch that you see in the analog hardware synthesizer. And in the second part of the video, I want to spend more time deep diving into the nuances of this patch and how I connected it to the lessons I have learned from AI. So if you are interested on looking into this workflow and or trying to reproduce this patch in your Moog Grandmother or any system that has similar capabilities, follow me. This is a very fun to play patch. It's very responsive and there are very different ways to play this patch and have a lot of fun with it. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Let me open Synth Plant AI for you here in my DAW, and then I click on what they call Geno Patch. That's where you can actually load samples, and here with a small sample of the song you can actually run the AI solutioning. That's on the cogwheel button there, and what you hear is Synth Plant trying to emulate the sample that you provided using their sound sources, their envelopes, their filters, and then you can explore different solutions. Like for instance, this one sounds good. You can click on it, and then you can click on the DNA side here, and that's where you can actually explode the different parameters like the envelopes or your. If you go down here and on the DNA, you can see the sound sources, and last part is related to filters and effects. But the solution provided not always will give you a final patch, so you have to sound design, but you start from a good starting point from the AI solution. And this was exactly my idea. So that file here is actually the solution I have used to create the patch you see in the Moog Grandmother there. So now we can explore a little bit what AI gave me as a starting point for envelopes and LFOs. We can look into the sound sources here, the oscillators, and also we can look into my starting point for filters and effects. So if I start from left to right, following Synth Plant DNA sequence there, the first section is the envelope and LFO, and the lesson that I could get from here was this repetitive trigger. Using the LFO to give me the note and response that we get from the sample in the original song. I initially thought maybe I could use a delay for that, but I really liked the AI solution of thinking about the trigger repetitions as VCA envelope, but also an LFO that creates this envelope modulation. If I now move to the sound sources, the oscillators, what AI have suggested here was a combination of two oscillators, one resembling pulse or a square wave and the other one more a saw up. But the main lesson for me here was actually the fact that oscillator B here, oscillator 2, is modulating oscillator A as frequency modulation, and this is what will give us the very metallic sound characteristic of the original song. And last but not least, here on my right, we can see the AI solution for filter and effects. And the filter is a sort of a combination of this high pass, or could I call it a low shelf there on our left, filtering out my low frequencies. And on the far right, you have this filtering that resembles a little bit of resonant low pass filter. Or this is at least the analogy I can do with the Moog Grandmother, translating the AI solution here into the capabilities I have on the Grandmother platform. But that's not the whole story, because if I start playing with Synth Plant from my MIDI controller, you can actually see here on the filter page that we get an animation of the filter, and what this animation is representing is actually the modulation of the filter cutoff frequency. And you can see here on the modulation page how this plays out. So this was also a very important element of the AI starting point. So these were the important elements that I want to emphasize to bring this into the exercise of designing the analog patch. So follow me and let's do an analysis on what I have done from this starting point into the Moog Grandmother. Before I start, a quick disclaimer. If you want to reproduce this patch into your Moog Grandmother, you will need one of those stackable cables. So one of the first lessons I want to bring from the AI starting point is in relation to our sound sources here. So let's have a look into my oscillator session to try to understand what is going on. If you remember from the AI solution in Synth Plant 2, what they come up with over there was this linear frequency modulation coming from a sawtooth into a square wave. And this was the metallic timbre to the patch on Synth Plant 2. I had a similar approach here. However, after many trials and errors, and due to my choices around modulation, I've actually chosen to modulate oscillator 2 from oscillator 1, but having both set to a square wave, to pulse. And you understand a little bit more about that when we talk about the modulation section here. Another thing that I made that I think contributed a lot for the timbre of this sound was to actually synchronize oscillator 2 into oscillator 1 here. I recently watched a very nice explanation around synchronizing two oscillators and how is this more complicated than what it seems to be. You can watch that video here in the card if you're interested. But the reasoning behind engaging this button here in my patch was to give an extra metallic quality to it. We'll talk a little bit more about the metallic characteristic of this patch when we talk about the spring reverb there. But basically, oscillator 1 is set to the long pulse waveform tuned to 32 feet. And oscillator 2 is set to long pulse tuned on 8 feet, but I have detuned my oscillator 2 here around about 1 o'clock. And when I talk a little bit more about ways of playing this patch, this is a very important parameter to tune in the frequencies that are emphasized by the filter. So let's see how I patched the linear frequency modulation here. If you see from the output of my oscillator 1, I'm pulling this cable here into my attenuator. And that's because the linear frequency modulation, when summed up with the sync and also the other modulation I'm using between oscillator 1 and 2, we're actually tuning the harmonies that were emphasized on the final output of the sound. So I wanted to have a little bit more control and a fine tuning of these harmonics, and that's why I added the attenuator here between the output of my oscillator 1 and the patch that actually goes into the linear frequency modulation input for oscillator 2. And my attenuation here is set around 2 o'clock. And then if we have a look here into the mixer, you'll see that oscillator 2 is the main sound cranked almost all the way up. And if you know the mixer in a mini Moog, this will also add some saturation to that sound source. But if you play around with oscillator 1 volume here, you will also see that this will change your fundamental and the octaves that you perceive as the main sound for this patch. I've also added noise in the mixer to contribute to this crunchy, saturated distortion sound that you get in the original music. So all of this is basically adding a lot of noise and crunch. But okay, that's that for my sound sources. So now let's have a look into what we have learned from AI in terms of filtering. It is really hard to talk about the filter without mentioning its modulation, but I'll try to split it up for didactic reasons here for you. So if you remember the filter shape from Synth Plant there, we had some sort of high pass filter filtering my lower frequencies there, and for sure a high pole low pass filter acting together. So since the Grandmother is a semi-modular system, the normal signal path is that the mixer output goes directly into low pass filter. If you want to actually include your high pass filter there, you need to start patching this filter so that it will take part in the signal chain. So we begin here following the default signal chain where the output of my mixer is going directly into the input of my low pass filter under the hood, pre-connected, and my settings here are a negative influence of the envelope amount to around 8:45 here, or a little bit below 9 on the negative range of the envelope amount. My resonance is set to around 11 o'clock, and that is a spice that you can actually tune in to your taste. No keyboard tracking, and my main filter cutoff frequency is set to around 12 o'clock, between 11 and 12 o'clock there. But if we remember, the pre-routed signal chain here would go from the output of the mixer into the input of low pass filter and then directly to the VCA. So in order to break that default path, what I'm doing, I'm patching the output of my low pass filter here into the input of the high pass. So this will connect the two filters in series, and then the configuration for my high pass filter there was slightly over 12 o'clock. But this was an experiment I did. So normally you have to connect the output of your high pass filter all the way into the VCA input there, but while trying to use the spring reverb to mimic the reverberation we saw on the Synth Plant 2 solution, what I realized is that the spring was actually resonating and oscillating by itself, giving even more metallic texture to this sound. So much so that if I unmute this patch now, you can hear the spring reverb resonating on its own. Have a listen. So this patch will be singing like that in a specific fundamental, even if you don't play any keys. And part of this is because I'm actually sending the live signal directly into the reverb, breaking the default connections between VCA and reverb here. I'm actually sending the signal in parallel to both. I don't know if I can call this a sidechain, but the fact is that when I splitted the signal like that and sent it directly into the reverb, I got this metallic sound resonating as a drone throughout the whole time. And something that was very special about the use of the spring reverb, the physical spring in this platform, was that you could do things like that. You can actually use the spring kick to give that industrial hit to it. Sometimes just by playing the notes with more intensity, I actually get the spring reverb to oscillate and work as a spring kick by itself. But at the core of this sound, what actually really makes this sound fun to play and to mimic the original song is the interactions with the LFO and the keyboard here. So let's have a look what is happening in the modulation section here and how does this relate to the way you play and what makes this patch so fun. So if you remember the Synth Plant AI solution there, all that attack and response of the note was coming from a relation between the envelope that was controlling the volume for the VCA and an LFO that worked as some sort of a trigger. When I first thought about designing this sound in whatever platform, my guess was to use some sort of delay to play with that offbeat response of every note I play. But I got inspired by the AI solution to actually explore modulation as a sort of an envelope in response for my original envelope. Let me show you how this works. So you see here, I play a note and actually the LFO is triggering more notes, and if I time the LFO correctly, I got that very nice rhythmic pattern of the original song. Even if I play a very simple pattern from my keyboard. So how does this work? Well, to make it more responsive, the first patch I did here was actually to get my keyboard out into my LFO sync in. And what this does is that every time I trigger a key, it will reset my LFO cycle. And that's how I can time what I'm playing to the rate of the LFO. Of course, this is an analog system, so the tempo here is dictated by turning this knob. You might as well, as an additional idea, bring in an external MIDI clock so that you can time this to the 130 BPMs of the original song. But you will see also when we talk about ideas on how to play this patch, how fun it is to mess up with the rate of this LFO live, although it's almost impossible to return to the time you've been before. But first things first. So first thing to do, sync your keyboard to your LFO cycle there. Then let's try to have a look into the parameters here for my LFO. The waveform I have chosen here was a sawtooth. If you remember in the Synth Plant solution, it was actually an exponential ramp down. So I thought that the best representation I could get to here was to use saw down as a waveform. However, these knobs here in the Moog Grandmother are part of the semi-modular under the hood routings you can do, meaning that from here I can actually affect the pulse width modulation or route my LFO modulation into the pulse width of any oscillator that is set into pulse and pulse width, pulse long or pulse short here. And of course I need to engage the mod wheel in order to also influence the depthness of each modulation. But my pulse width modulation amount here is set to about 10 o'clock, and what this is doing in practice is influencing both the sync between LFO 1 and 2, but also giving movement to the timbre there. In essence, I thought that this was a nice contribution to the noisy metallic sound that both the linear FM and the sync were producing in oscillator 2 there. Again, a lot of try and error, but if you remember on Synth Plant 2, the square wave there had some movement while triggering the notes. So this was what I was trying to emulate here. My pitch amount is set to 0. I'm not influencing the pitch of any of the oscillators, even more because my mod wheel is fully engaged here. So any value that I throw there will put my oscillators out of tune quite easily. However, I am routing the LFO influence into the cutoff frequency there. And if you remember when I talked about the low pass filter here, I'm also using envelope modulation there, but we talk more about that when I show you what is going on in the envelope. Last but not least, in this keyboard / modulation section, I am patching the velocity of my keyboard all the way into my low pass filter cutoff frequency input there. So you see 3 modulations for the cutoff frequency are engaged. I am modulating the cutoff frequency of low pass filter here from my LFO rate through this knob. I am modulating the cutoff frequency depending on the velocity I play in my keyboard here, and I am also influencing that cutoff frequency from my envelope. Let's listen what is the result of that in terms of keyboard velocity. Notice also how the LFO resets every time I engage with the key, so that's the role of this patch over there. But now let's have a look into the other secret sauce from this patch, which is the envelope. So if you remember on Synth Plant on page 1, we saw that almost symmetrical relation between what the LFO was doing and the envelope was doing. But because my LFO is modulating the cutoff frequency of the low pass filter here, the effect that it creates is almost as if this was another trigger for my sound. So one trigger when I actually engage with the keyboard, but you get the illusion of the sound getting louder, almost like an envelope controlling the amplifier volume there, because you have this opening and closing of the cutoff frequency there. So when this knob goes downwards, it muffles the sound, which have a similar result as a volume decrease. And it's actually on the fine tuning of the tempo between this modulation here to the cutoff frequency and the modulation from the envelope into both the cutoff frequency but also the volume of the amplifier that is creating this pulse and response from when I trigger the note and when a note bounces back on the up tempo. And that is what actually makes this patch very fun to play. So let's have a look into our times here for my VCA envelope. There is a slight fraction here, less than half of a step into my envelope attack. And what this does is helping me to articulate the first trigger from the note to not be so high. So then when we get the bounce from the modulation here, also the volume of the note is a little lower. But the parameter that is actually timing with my LFO rate here is actually decay. And my decay is set to nearly 9 o'clock. And it's actually the decay that gives the time between the first attack of the note when you open up, also by syncing the keyboard and using velocity to open up the filter from the first trigger into the note response. So it was on fine-tuning the decay here that I actually got the bouncing effect. And funny enough, the release tempo that is set around 2 o'clock was giving me a sort of a hitch hat response. I can only guess that this is because this envelope also have an influence in my cutoff frequency, and as a result, when the cutoff frequency goes up, we can actually hear this noise sounding. And that's why I almost get a cymbal if I prolong enough the interval between a trigger of a note and another. Let's have a listen. You can have more of the noise escaping by modulating either directly the filter cutoff frequency there or the influence of the envelope here if you want to have more of this white noise coming through. So if you time it right, you get more of the coming from the noise in between every note. Before I start messing up with the original patch, even for my own sake here, I cannot save this patch. Sustain level is set to the 4th degree there. Okay, this is it for reproducing this patch, but now let's have a look on how to play and also what is the influence of some parameters here that you can change on the fly to increase your expression during your performance. The first parameter I wanted to show you, it's actually the fine-tuning of oscillator 2 here and how this influences the harmonic content of every note. Let's have a listen. Here I'm more on the bass side of things, but if I go to a third interval, I get a much more aggressive acid type of sound. Here the original, and then you can of course exaggerate all the way down to a more bassy sound. But if you want to go that territory, Then you also have to interact with the high pass filter here, because several of those low frequencies are being cut by this one. Another thing you can do in post-production, since you have that equalization of your frequencies cutting on both sides, you can boost a little bit more into your high frequencies if you want to get some more bass out of the sound. Normally an easy access parameter to start interacting with your sound is the cutoff frequency, but for me this was not giving very good results. And that's because since we are filtering so much the lower frequencies here, if I go down, I rapidly lose volume and start losing the punch in this sound. I think it's already filtered very in the mids region there, so I don't recommend interacting directly with a filter cutoff frequency there. But for sure, those two here can be interesting to play. So if you want a more traditional opening or widening of your low pass filter, you can interact with the envelope amount modulation here. Here more in the bassy region, and the more you open up, more on the acid side of things you get. And that's because my resonance here is cranked quite high as well. I don't recommend playing too much with resonance there, because the sound is also a lot about tuning the natural harmonics there, and that's the emphasis I gave. But for sure, if you want to have a more traditional opening and closing of the filter, you can play around with an envelope modulation there. And now let's have a listen on what happens when we mess around with the spring reverb while playing. You can hear how it resonates, but if you crank it too much, you will also get rid of all the fundamentals and the articulation of your sound there. But this adds for sure a character to the sound, and the fact that you can kick the spring adds a little flavor to how to interact with this sound. Another thing that I was playing around while messing up with this patch was actually the LFO rate here. And that's because in the original sound you have that sample feel of this last note here where they trigger it faster, and that is something I cannot really do in this patch because of the pulse and response of the notes there. I can for sure play the notes in sequence, and what this will give me, it's a reset of my LFO, and also if I'm sensitive enough I can play with velocity there. So I can play it respecting the LFO rate for the pulse and response. Playing a simpler pattern, or I can repeat the notes, but in any case, I have to respect the LFO rate. So in order to try to have that sample quality to it, I can actually mess up with the LFO rate, even to a point where the LFO self-oscillates, adding completely new harmonics to the sound. But I must confess that it's really hard to go back in a live situation to the song real tempo, but it's quite fun to mess with it. Have a listen. Yeah, and I mean, definitely Prodigy did a lot of post-production in their sound, and it's a wonderful sounding timbre. It doesn't matter if it comes from a guitar, a synth, or sampling the mythical James Bond theme. But the thing with this patch, it is that it was a lot of fun both to design this sound, to try to play with the tempo, but also all these different possibilities on how to play this patch. I haven't tried to apply it musically to other compositions, but I bet people can come up with creative ways of using this patch. And I also wanted to show you this exploration that you can actually use available technologies, use your DAW and virtual instruments as a starting point for actually creating your very physical, intangible analog patch. I for sure learned both from Synth Plant, but from doing this exercise on the Mini Moog. Let me know if you have enjoyed this workflow. Let me know if you have tried in your system. Thanks a lot for all the subscribers, you guys that interact with me in the comments. I do listen to what you say and try to calibrate the content based on your feedback. But also thanks if it's your first time in the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.